Welcome to Module 5. Module 5 is the module that deals with gender in international strategies and policy frameworks. I'm glad to be presenting this module. Once again, my name is Richard Sewakirianga, the course director for this course, Gender Responsive Economic Policy Management in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Today, what I'm going to do is to give you a quick snapshot of what Module 5 covers. Module 5 is a very interesting module because it's a module that takes us in the whole larger area of international strategies, development strategies, and policy frameworks. As you know, in the last modules, we've covered the foundations. We've covered the connection between gender and economics. We've covered the connection between gender and unpaid care work. We've looked at issues of gender and data. And now we are looking at a module on gender in international strategies and policy frameworks. So really, to start off this module, let me first highlight a little bit about what the module is all about. Module 5's objective is really to review in a very, very broad way the evolution of development strategies in post-independence Africa using macroeconomic theory, and it builds on an analysis of the development strategies from a gender perspective. The module will also help you to develop some skills that are needed to evaluate to what extent development strategies incorporate gender perspectives in their policy assessments and proposals. And a subsidiary aim of this module is to analyze the history of development strategies and policy through a gender lens. The module will also review the contemporary macroeconomic development strategies in the context of globalization and the economic realities in Africa by critically evaluating the poverty reduction strategies of the 1990s, a little bit about the MDGs, the SDGs now, Agenda 2030, Agenda 2063, and some of the other associated frameworks. And the module will bring together material from earlier modules that we had and add a little bit of new material to make connections between the historical and contemporary policy shifts that we have seen across Africa. So in terms of the expected outcomes, there are really two important outcomes. One is to locate state-led development, structural adjustment, and neoliberalism within the context of the macroeconomic theory, and also to offer some kind of analysis of state-led development, structural adjustment, and neoliberalism within a framework of gender-aware macroeconomics. And as much as possible, we shall draw from some of the African examples that we have. Now, in terms of readings, there are several readings that you can get around here. You can look at some of the current policy frameworks that we're working with globally, but also in Africa. The Agenda 2030 of the United Nations would be a good place to go and have a review, but also the Agenda 2063, as well as the earlier kind of policy frameworks like MDGs and SDGs. So to dive into the module itself, in this module, we start off with an overview of the development strategies of post-independence Africa. And if we were working together in a room, one of the things we usually start with is a short exercise where you do a timeline and reflect on your country's economic performance and the various development strategies that are pursued in the years after independence. And I would really encourage for those of you who can to do this. I know that maybe it's only countries like Ethiopia that don't have a colonial history, but most of us in African countries have a colonial history. But even in those countries that don't have a colonial history, there is a time when you are starting to see major development shifts. So drawing such a timeline would be an important exercise for your own learning. So I want to encourage you to do this exercise, and you can use some of the questions that are there below to start off that discussion or to think through this process. One is, what development strategies were pursued over the last 30 years after independence in your country, and what were the main differences and approaches associated with each of them, and what were the reasons for the new development strategy to replace an earlier one, and what were the roles of external and internal, and what were the roles of external and internal stakeholders, but also what factors, and also the extent you do, and also to ask the question, to what extent do you feel that gender issues were reflected in each of these development strategies? You know, when we are together, we have a report back from a group. But again, if you can share your thoughts in the discussion forum, it will really be helpful for the rest of us to learn. So those of you, I want to challenge you to share your thoughts in the discussion forum. Now, in terms of diversity of experiences, if you do that exercise, all of you, you will realize that if you see what different countries have done in Africa, all countries in Africa, you will find there is something typical, that they have experienced some form of colonialization that was then followed by political independence. Most countries experienced some form of structural adjustment policy around the 80s and the 90s. And most countries were more recently have adopted what is called the national strategies, modeled to varying degrees to what is the poverty reduction strategies in the 1990s. But recently, we've seen also that there is a shift with many countries starting to develop national development plans, as I'll be talking about later. Now, in some of the differences we see is that in sub-Saharan Africa, we have seen also that there have been some interesting dynamics that have come through. One of the things in sub-Saharan Africa is that independence occurred at different points. Ghana became independent in 1957, and it was followed by countries like Angola and Mozambique. In 1957, Angola and Mozambique was about 1975, which was like 20 years later. For most of French-speaking Africa, it was early 60s, then 1960 for most former French colonies, and 1962 for most of the Belgian colonies in North Africa. We see some French colonies became independent a bit earlier, like Tunisia and Morocco in 1956. Liberia was a special case, officially independent in the mid-19th century. Independence was also followed by some, in some places, with white minority rule, for example, in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And in some cases, the transition to independence was relatively peaceful. And in other cases, it was characterized by prolonged conflict and violence in some places. And the major peculiarities in some other places, like Rwanda, it's a recent one in 1995 when they had a genocide, and that was also a turning point for them. Now, the classification of post-independence strategies, you know, one can do a classification broadly around about 4 important differences in terms of post-independence development strategies. We have in the 60s and the 70s, the state-led development. Immediately after independence, many countries, the first thing they did was to nationalize, to bring together all the national assets that were being held by the colonial governments under the roof of one government. And the governments started owning things from hotels to factories to, all kinds of places. And that was very much also an expression of confidence, which the post-colonial Africa had in the state. And the state was seen as an important player that could do development, that could invest in the strategic sectors that would drive the economies. States borrowed a lot of money to build banks, build hotels, build schools, build hospitals, build factories, do lots of development. In many countries, you have this characteristic of the 60s where many things were really state-owned. Now, that went on for a couple of decades, or even 3 decades in some places, between 1960s and 70s. But the 80s and 90s, there was then a shift, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that shift of structural adjustment and what that meant and where it came from. But also we see another era that comes after structural adjustment after the 90s, where we see some kind of move towards poverty reduction as a central point in the work that would be undertaken. So you see a lot of calls for structural adjustment and the move towards using poverty reduction strategy papers after the structural adjustment era. Now, after 2000, what we have also witnessed is quite a significant move towards some kind of move towards what has now come to be known as the era of national development plans. So we are seeing quite a bit of national development plans in many parts of Africa, starting to be a critical part of African development. And that is another era. So you can see that there are about 4 eras that one would want to look at. What are the characteristics of these eras? I think there are several characteristics, but a key characteristic that came out is that for the state-led approach to development, the key characteristics were that there was a focus on industrialization and what was called self-sufficiency, with countries focusing on having their own investments and development and all those kinds of things. They had, as I have said before, a lot of public investments in infrastructure, schools, universities, state-led enterprises, state-led finance, and like ownership of banks and many other things of that nature. But also government regulations in most of the spheres of economic activity was a major characteristic of this era. Tariffs and quotas and other restrictions on international trade, for example, to protect some of the national impact industries was a characteristic of this era. And this necessitated quite a bit of foreign borrowing to supply the imports needed to invest in building a productive capacity in the real economy. If you look at gender and state-led development, during that era, what we see is at that time, an unstated but necessary condition of this strategy was that unpaid care work would actually supply the labor that was required for the productive sector necessary for to increase productive capacity. And so the state-led enterprise was really built on this model that household will supply labor and there wasn't any focus on attention to things like unpaid care. However, this condition, as you can imagine, was problematic as women were already highly economically active, especially across Africa, in many things, in unpaid care work, in agricultural labor. I mean, if you read, for example, there's a very interesting book that was written a few decades ago by an author called Esther Bozra that wrote about women and agricultural labor and agricultural development in Africa, and showed that women are playing quite a significant role in the agriculture sector in Africa. But women were also and have been historically very much part of the informal economy in Africa. Market women, for example, are part of even a characteristic of some of the colonial economies in Africa. And thus, the lack of time to increase their unpaid care work was one of the challenges that while state-led development thought and believed it would deliver through unpaid care work being available to supply labor, that was not always true. And additionally, women were not able to participate beneficially in formal export sector and other sectors because, again, of the differentials in education, in training, and many other things. And they thus participated very much, and you can see they would be underrepresented, also overrepresented in sectors like agriculture, and often working under their husbands in households, and also in very unequal relationships. And often women's programs were, sometimes of a domestic type. So this is an era where you had things like home economics being taught to in schools and being emphasized for girls, and that kind of thing where women were taught either to cook, how to sew, how to look after homes, and those kinds of very deeply gender-biased occupations. So that was one of the characteristics, or some of the characteristics of this era. And during this period, the result was that there was quite a bit of import-led investments where we had high rates of economic growth accompanied by external borrowing. While there was quite a bit of economic growth, countries in Africa grew quite significantly, but also they were heavily borrowing to invest in all that infrastructure like schools, hospitals, factories, and many other things that were being promoted by the state. Restructuring institutions to serve the new Black elite of the time who were entering into what was seen as the white institutions of the time. Thus brought about this Africa where you had a distinction. A Nigerian author has written a very interesting piece on this called The Two Publics in Africa. If you put it in Google or search it on the internet, it will pop up, but it tells about this dichotomy between the civic and the primordial publics in Africa, which really affected how African public sector was run. And this is something I can't go into now, but if you read, it will be very helpful. And anyone who wants it, you can send me a message and I can share that paper. Building up debt and capital flight was one of the characteristics of this time, and also the inflow of resources that might have expanded the productive sector more if the constraints for using female labor were addressed. Because there was no address to the fact that you had a constraint in terms of how much women could participate. That meant that the expansion of the productive capacity was still limited because it was targeting men and not always targeting men and women. And that was an issue. Now, fast forward, if we go to the structural adjustment period. Now, here you see also an interesting dynamic happening. because the structural adjustment period was built on the thinking, on the idea that what you had was that there was this critique of the state, that the state is no longer effective, that the state cannot deliver. And that critique of the state is one of the things that characterized the mid-80s, the 80s and 90s, which is known as the structural adjustment era. And looking at the state as being inefficient. And this was drawing from things like the Washington Consensus, with its emphasis on market liberalization. And it was replacing the Keynesian Consensus, whose emphasis was on the role of the state in employment generation, growth, and redistribution. So you can see that there was still a tension here. But the Washington Consensus was really focusing on the liberalization as a way of promoting development across Africa. And the goal of structural adjustment was really to address the macroeconomic imbalances that had emerged in African economies during the state-led development, the high level of indebtedness, the high levels of debt servicing costs, the balance of payment deficits that countries were going through, including the budgetary deficits. And for African countries with large debts and the inability to service them, the IMF then now came in and started acting as the lender of last resort. And this was in exchange for adopting economic policy conditions designed to alter the way the economies operated, and reinforced by the World Bank and other multilateral donors across Africa. Now, the typical components of the structural adjustment period or era, I will summarize them very quickly, but you can also again read about them. One was exchange rate devaluation. And the point here was by making domestic currencies worth less than if you put that in relation to foreign currencies. Imports were discouraged because they became more and more expensive. Exports were encouraged because they were cheaper. Global competitiveness was thus enhanced, and a possible way of addressing trade and balance and payment balances was therefore introduced, because when you devalue your currency, then of course, while you earn less from what you export, but you become attractive on the export market. In terms of fiscal austerity, that was another part and element within the structural adjustment times. And that was really about reducing government mandatory deficits that had been incurred, because many of these governments had run up large deficits. And fiscal austerity was one of those measures that was focusing on how governments can come down and do something about these deficits. And also looking at financial deregulation and monetary reform. And the point here was that there was also this focus on liberalization of the financial markets, along with the use of high interest rates as a principal tool for monetary policy. And this was a way of controlling inflation by making it less attractive to hold money in cash, thus withdrawing money out of the economy, out of circulation. Another one was deregulation of the economy to improve economic efficiency, it was argued, and to allow markets to allocate resources instead of having policymakers having to do that. And there was a concerted effort to loosen government regulations so that economic activity wasn't being restricted. There were no price controls and all those kinds of things. And that was also followed by significant forms of trade liberalization, while in the lowering of tariff and non-tariff barriers, trade reduced the cost of imports, including imported inputs, but it did so by less than the increases in the prices that were brought about by deregulation. At the same time, trade liberalization made exporting easier. So trade liberalization promoted quite a bit of exports while it compressed imports. Privatization was also one of the things that was part of the SAPS, where state-owned enterprises were sold off under the argument that this was making them much more efficient and responsive to the signals produced by the freer, better functioning market, and eliminating things like unnecessary employment and bureaucratic interferences. And one of the things we saw around that was the huge numbers of retrenchment of workers that had to happen across Africa. Now, in summary, of macroeconomic theory during the SAP period was that it sought to really alter the rate of domestic absorption by two overarching sets of policies. And when we go to the macroeconomics module, we will hear more about this. One was expenditure reduction, which focused on making sure that there is fiscal stability, monetary reform, devaluation of policies that compressed government goods and services through government, so that the demand of consumers and farms was shifting the aggregate demand curve. And the intent here was that demand could be compressed and established at a lower and more sustainable level. Now, on the other side, you had the expenditure switching policies, which included things like deregulation, trade liberalization, privatization. And these were designed as ways of enhancing the productive capacity of boosting production of goods and services. And they would shift the aggregate supply curve so that supply could increase. And now in some, the IMF policies cut demand, while the World Bank policies expanded supply. So there was that interaction among both of them to increase production and decrease the price level, and therefore altering the rate of domestic absorption to foster economic growth. And of course, one of the things that came out of these discussions over time was a structural adjustment. We're really engaging from the perspective that, macroeconomic policies were gender neutral. Now, what were some of the issues around these macroeconomic policies, these structural adjustment policies and gender? Now, SAPS did not take into consideration the fact that labor is reproduced by households, and hence a cut back on social services does affect investments in human capital at a household level, and therefore they produce low quality labor. What does that mean? Means very simply that, when SAPS, structural adjustment policies were being designed, there was no thinking about where does labor come from, who makes sure that what is brought onto the market in terms of an economic agent is an efficient agent. And because there wasn't that feeling that that was important, and when we went into things like, retrenchment, one of the challenges that retrenchment brought was that the quality of labor that then was produced by household had to go down because of the different household shocks that were under and social shocks that were, affected these kinds of things. Now, women's productive activities, especially the smallholders, were affected also by SAPS. Liberalization meant that smallholder would have to compete with large-scale export businesses that were in place, and this in itself was affecting different kinds of organizations. Now, SAPS also meant that there were quite a bit of job cuts, especially for lower cadres, especially if you went into public offices. What you ended up seeing was that significant people who lost their jobs fast included people like typists, like cleaners, and messengers, and those kinds of jobs. And so those jobs were actually ones that were being done by women, and many of them, were the ones who were retrenched fast. So in a sense, there was quite a significant differential impact on women and men by this during this period. Poverty reduction strategy papers is also another era that followed the SAP era. I think the SAP era, one of the things that became very evident quickly was that, SAPs had left quite a bit of challenges in communities. Poverty had increased in many parts of Africa because of effects of retrenchment. We didn't find as many efficient market models that were working after industries were privatized and all that. So PRSPs came in as wide-ranging, results-oriented poverty reduction plans that were replacing the structural adjustment plans. Initially, countries had to develop their PRSPs to qualify for debt relief under the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, that was called the HIPIC at that time. And later, some African countries like Kenya did not qualify for debt relief, also developed poverty reduction strategy papers to access other types of donor funds. In Rwanda, for example, they implemented the PRSPs over a period of time. Now, PRSPs were predicated on the proposition that countries, multilateral and bilateral donors, and government and civil society are all development partners. So that's when we started hearing the term national ownership being used quite a bit. And the elements of national ownership were that the stakeholders, the multi-stakeholders would participate in the design to overcome the ineffectiveness of structural adjustment policies by responding to the social costs of adjustment. Now, PRSPs also adopted a longer time horizon than the structural adjustment policies. They then became 3 to 5 year horizons. And they argued that economic growth is important, but they also said economic growth is not a sufficient condition in terms of what it could do for people's well-being, that there was a need to invest significantly in human capital formation and focus on poverty reduction. And the MDGs at the time also increased the value of PRSPs by offering the global benchmarks and targets that countries then used in the national PRSP processes. But what did not change in the SAPs and the PRSPs is actually the macroeconomic strategies that were used for both of them. Some of the criticisms of PRSPs included things like the links between poverty reduction and poverty descriptives in the documents, and the policy diagnosis were weak, because the processes that distribute income and human capital and power in society, while they were mentioned, they were not fully analyzed under the PRSPs. And the links between agreed policy priorities and budgetary allocations were also weak because donor support was directed where resources were. And the capacity to track government spending and outcomes was weak, but also the monitoring and evaluation procedures, because most of the data was not actually produced and well analyzed at the time. In terms of gender, the PRSPs and gender, one of the critical challenges that was mentioned and highlighted at the time was that PRSPs contained far more attention to women and gender equality outcomes than the structural adjustment policies. So that was one of the ways in which there was a praise. However, often the focus at the time, it was highlighted that the focus was mostly only on outcomes, not on gender stereotypes, gender structures, gender dynamics that sometimes underlie the inequalities between women and men, which are rooted in the structure of the economic life of women and men. And many PRSPs, gender was not mainstreamed throughout the document. What you had was the introduction of one standalone gender and women and gender chapter in many places. So while PRSPs contain sex desegregated data, often the gender indicators were not mainstreamed into the tools of PRSP overall, and also in their monitoring and evaluation. So while the gender received more attention in PRSPs, other than other cross-cutting issues, the budgetary commitments, to gender equity were not sufficiently incorporated. And actually, it was during that era that then what we shall see in the second last module, gender budgeting, then became quite a bit of a push, a policy advocacy push by those who believed in better gender analysis and gender budget allocations. Now, the benefits of gender-aware PRSPs and national plans. PRSPs in many countries have now ended, but there are lessons that are being learned for future development planning. Poverty reduction, one of the lessons learned was that to reduce poverty, gender dimensions of poverty must be identified and addressed. So the differential access and control of resources should be at the heart of poverty. The issue of economic growth, statistical evidence suggests that gender equality correlates with economic growth and poverty reduction, and the analysis of the implication of unpaid care work and how to address its impact on the participation of women and men in the productive sector. And on human rights fulfillment, one of the lessons learned was that gender equality is a foundation of a full set of human rights. To treat women and men equally is both a right and also an obligation that states had to think about. The benefits of gender-aware PRSPs and national plans. One is that reducing male and female disparities in education is very popular in PRSPs, but the strategies that configure gender norms in education regarding recruitment, retention, curricula, adult education remain very limited. And this is an important social sector investment issue. And gender aspects of social protection mechanisms are still very weak in PRSPs. For example, the gender implications of things like pension systems were not considered very often, yet these were central and substantive equality between women and men. Now, PRSPs also had a very mixed gender and governance record. There are often commitments of rewriting laws and increasing women's participation, but funding for this rarely came, and simultaneously committed towards improving gender and governance report was not always done. So yeah, there were several steps forward, a lot of things that were gained, but quite a bit is still needed. So now, as I come to the end of this summary, let me speak a little bit about the national development plans. Now, the national development plans, the countries with a national development plan actually right now are quite many. If you look globally, more than 134 countries by 2018 had national development plans. There were only about 62 had these plans in 2006, which is nearly 80% of the global population right now lives in a country with a national development plan. Now, national development planning has had a very checkered history, anchored in the failure of centrally planned economies of the 50s and 60s that we talked about earlier. Now, this new wave of national development planning has implications not only for how countries respond to global and local challenges that we confront, but also it has implications in different ways. The fact that there is a need for national development planning is also related to the fact that countries are also reasserting themselves and reacting to the dominant trend of the 3 decades that have gone by, where economic liberalization, marketization, deregulations seem to rule the day when it came to economic policy planning. Now, this trend, of course, created gender economic inequality while socializing many of the risks and amplifying certain shocks. For example, the financial crisis of 2008 and the increasing frequency and severity of economic, especially financial and currency crises. Now, the reassertion of the need for national development planning is also a response to the possibilities that have been offered by new flows of financing, especially the new natural resources, with many countries across the world starting to discover oil, resources that find economic commodity boom, and at the same time, the more policy space that has been created by the decline of the leverage of international financial institutions and the Washington Consensus, as well as the HIPC. I think national development plans in some ways are pushing back at this narrative by saying, look, you have tried for the last few decades to make things work, but haven't. So now countries are quickly saying, we can take it on and do it ourselves. What are the characteristics that we see in the current national development plans across Africa? New national development planning is largely practice-led. It's a practice-led paradigm with a body of knowledge, concepts, and practices that relate both to state responses and to economic globalization, and to how they plan to implement the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. Another characteristic is that they define a new paradigm of what is now seen as real ownership in terms of closer fit of plans with electoral cycles, nationally determined priorities, and sometimes reference to global or in Africa, subcontinental processes. But also we see another characteristic is that in some ways a conceptual and methodological paradigm that with characteristics that are in some ways distinct from the planning practices of the 50s and the 60s. So there is a way in which while it is about the nation, it's not about state-led development alone. It's where what you see is a blending of private-public partnerships becoming a new form of engagement. Now, national planning is also offering certain insights into how development ideology and policy are being remade in a multipolar world. Before you had sort of a bipolar world, but the bipolar world which had the Cold War and the countries from either being part of the one alignment or being aligned to one side or another. To the capitalist or the communist is no longer such a major paradigm. So with this multipolar world, again, national development is sort of coming to it by sort of fusing development ideology and policy together. Now, the reasons why they have emerged are largely what we talked about, the HIPC conditionalities that meant that PRSPs led back to the national development plan in some countries with the emphasis of national planning, but also the new wave is in response to the challenge posed by the MDGs and the SDGs now, the existence of these increasingly comprehensive sets of development plans and monitoring frameworks, and countries quickly saying, no, we can do some of these things on our own. Now, NDPs have also emerged as a counter-narrative to global agreement, as we also touched on. And there is also a crucial point is that national plans are providing a window into the nature of development of what one can call a post-neoliberal world, and views that run counter to global ideas are sometimes part of these national development plans. But I think they are like an exercise in innovation and trying to expand new ways of thinking. Now, the return to national planning is also an effort by countries to manage both the upside, but also the downside risks of liberal globalization. There is an attempt by emerging economies to try and find ways in which they can build resilient but also integrated national economies that are capable of facing the downside risks of globalization on one side, but are also seen in the events such as the 1998 East Africa, East Asian crisis, or the 2009 grand recessions. And countries are trying to come back to some of these things by returning to some kind of way in which they can, eliminate certain risks that came from those processes. Now, the key issues on gender and national development plans, integrating gender into this process requires both political and economic groundwork, which is something that the advocates for WID, Women in Development and Gender in Development, have been very clear about. The measures to institutionalize gender machineries in state bureaucracies has been a response in some of the places. Sometimes while the credibility of that is challenged as a policy concept, there is an understanding of the significance of this shift in thinking and in appreciating gender and development as part and parcel of national development processes. Feminist theories of the state suggest that state is gendered, is a gendered institution that largely is oriented towards male interests, but that it is a complex set of institutions with conflicting interests. And I think this theorization of the state not being a monolithic or gender-blind institution is also helping to actually infuse more gender work into the state development. Now, gender policy challenges and the purpose and practice of gender across all development arenas, from each specific development sector to overarching systems of law, property ownership, political representation. That in itself is also becoming important. But, people are no longer talking about this as an important purpose to do gender work, but also to think through what does it mean in practice? What are the areas we should think about and how do we do it practically? Mainstreaming measures have also been used to provoke gender-sensitive institutional, policy, and operational challenges in the public sector, but also to make responsiveness to women's interests part of the routine that different institutions should talk about. So what I've done in this is to really do a broad brush, a little bit longer than other videos. But the idea here has been to give you, about 50 years, policy shift narrative, broad brush narrative of how policies have been shifting over time and what this has meant for us, and therefore what does it mean if you are going to do better gender and economic policy analysis. So I hope this video has given you a bit of a broad brush. Once again, please read the narrative because the narrative gives you a little bit more detail. And in case you need any more literature, there's literature I can share with you, but I need to know who needs it so that I can share with you, for those who need it, and we can then have a conversation. But thank you very much for listening. We'll then put this up next week, at the end of this week, so that yes, from next week, you can now start seeing how to engage with this a little bit more. Thank you very much, and see you next time.